A gang of robbers carried out the largest bank robbery in U.S. history. The operation was executed with a high level of meticulousness. The complicated and smart steps followed by the robbers proved their professionalism. How could such professional robbers get arrested? How could such meticulous robbers get arrested due to trivial errors? That's what we are going to figure out in today's story. Our story's event took place in Los Angeles in 1972, exactly on Monday, March 27. A manager of a large branch of the United Bank of California went as usual to unlock the bank vault. However, when he tried to open the door, it wouldn't open. Many bankers came and tried harder to open the door, but all their efforts were pointless. The manager asked to call the safe manufacturer because they are responsible for its maintenance. 20 minutes later, the company technician arrived and started examining the vault and checking the door locking system, trying to figure out the reason why the door didn't open. He kept on trying for several hours, but to no avail. The combination was right, the lock was in place, and everything seemed normal, but there was no explanation for why the door didn't open. The technician then suggested climbing into the rafter above the vault. He was stunned when he saw an opening hole on the vault roof and above another opening on the bank roof. He immediately realized that the vault had been robbed, and the thieves cut off a hole in the bank roof and then another hole in the vault roof. The technician got down to the vault through the hole, and the first thing he noticed was the amount of dust that covered everything in the vault. Everything in there was upside down. Bags, safety boxes, etc. When he checked the vault door from the inside, he noticed a screwdriver jammed into the locked gears. It was clear that the thieves wanted to delay the discovery of the robbery for as long as possible. The technician immediately took out the screwdriver, and the door opened normally. Right after that, the bank called the police. Officers and investigators arrived and started examining the crime scene straight away. The vault was upside down, everything was stolen, and it was a big mess. Many items were thrown on the ground, including watches, rings, pictures, documents, and many of the properties of the safety box's owners. The thieves tried to steal the most precious items and leave items with less value. The investigators knew that place arrangements, and knowing the size of losses and loot would take effort and time, and they needed to quickly know how the thieves managed to get into the vault that was supposed to be impregnable and immune. The first thing they noticed when they examined the debris left by the hole was that the cement dust was mixed with other strange materials. They found dark soil and pieces of burlap all over the place. The dark soil was most likely gunpowder. The investigators wondered why the alarm system didn't work when the thieves stormed the vault. The vault was equipped with many alarm devices. The first one was installed on the exterior wall of the bank and was supposed to give a high alert sound if someone entered. However, the alarm device was found covered by a white liquid that prevented it from declaring any alert. They had also found a steel ladder in an area close to the bank. Due to this evidence, the investigators managed to get an overview of the way the thieves entered the bank. Firstly, they unlocked the alert bell box and sprayed it with liquid styrofoam. It hardened, freezing the clapper in place and rendering the alarm useless. Then, using the steel ladder, they climbed onto the bank roof, carrying their drills and their own cutting and digging tools. They used bank electricity to turn on their tools. Afterward, they dug the first hole in the bank building roof, which wasn't impregnable then. They were in the rafter, but the vault roof was harder because it was made of concrete and reinforced by iron. Before working on the vault roof, there was another alarm device directly above the vault. This device was supposed to directly send a signal to the police as soon as the vault was stormed. Although it was a secret device that no one knew about, but the bank managers and the police, the thieves had information about it, which proved that the thieves had accurately planned the robbery. Moreover, it seemed that one of them was an alarm device expert because the investigators, after examining the device, found out that the thieves cut off the wire that was supposed to send a signal to the police and then welded the wires together in a way that no signal could be transmitted. The thieves were at a high level of professionalism, and they knew exactly what they were doing. It wasn't a normal operation, but it required accuracy and high skills instead. After disabling the alarm, the toughest challenge was left, which was the vault concrete roof that was 40 centimeters thick and reinforced by iron. Even with the strongest drills and digging tools, it would take weeks to penetrate the roof. The thieves made small holes using drills and then inserted dynamite. It was a smart method, and it might be the only way to open a hole in such a tough roof. The blast had to be directed down so as not to harm the thieves. They brought many burlaps full of sand and placed them over the explosives, dynamite holes, so as to not only direct the blast to the ground, but to muffle the sound too. After the explosion, they managed to open a hole in the vault roof, but the blast didn't break the iron supports. The thieves had already taken this into consideration, so they brought an acetylene torch, which they used to cut the iron supports. They were prepared for everything. They knew each problem and which tool they needed to overcome it. They thought about every little detail, which stunned the investigators. After the investigations learned about the way the thieves entered the vault, they started looking for any trace left behind. They knew that the thieves who carried out such an accurate operation wouldn't leave any trace behind. They were right, because after examining the place several times, no fingerprint or DNA was found, and they found nothing that could help them. The only thing they found was a pair of black gloves. It seemed that it belonged to one of the thieves, in addition to a drill bit, but none of these were helpful. The officer's next task was to evaluate the loot size. The bank claimed that $50,000 vanished from the vault, but the amount was nothing compared to the valuable items that were inside the safety deposit boxes. It was clear that the thieves opened the safety deposit boxes forcibly, and since the robbery occurred during the weekend holiday, the thieves had time to open the safety boxes, search them, and sort the items that were inside. They took valuable items and left everything with no value, such as photos and documents. Of course, the bank didn't know what was inside the safety deposit boxes, but their owners did. So the police had to interview all the owners of the safety deposit boxes so as to evaluate the size of the losses. Those boxes were full of jewelry, watches, bonds, and even cash. After the police interviewed 10 boxes owners, they'd managed to estimate the worth of the stolen item at $80 million. That is to say, this robbery was the largest bank robbery in America's history. Of course, there were larger robberies later, but until that time, this was the largest. Imagine that the officers were conducting an investigation into the largest bank robbery in American history with no evidence or any leads that could help them. The first thing they decided to start with was to track the tools used by the robbers. They knew about most of the tools thanks to their examination of the robbery. The robbers used huge drills, cables, sandbags, and dynamite explosives, in addition to blacksmithing tools. So the police started going to the shops that were in the area that could sell such tools or the materials used for their fabrication. They went to those shops' owners, asking for their last sales, which might be suspicious. But their trial was pointless. They found nothing helpful. The officers were confused. They didn't know what to do. There was no evidence, no witnesses, and no suspects, as if the thieves had carried out the perfect robbery that was impossible to resolve. The file case was handed over to the FBI, which is determined to identify the robbers and find them wherever they are. As soon as the FBI got the robbery's details, they realized that they would chase professional robbers with a lot of experience in the field. This was the first bank robbery in Los Angeles that was carried out with such professionalism, so the FBI concluded that these robbers were from another state or another city. The first thing the Los Angeles FBI office did was transmitting a message to all the other FBI offices all over the United States, in which they gave a well-detailed explanation about the robbery that took place in Los Angeles and asked if there was an FBI office that had dealt with such an operation before. They got a quick response from Ohio. The Ohio FBI office said that they were investigating 13 bank robberies that were similar to the Los Angeles robbery. As soon as the Ohio FBI officers heard about the robbery details, such as the styrofoam liquid that froze the bell, the storming from the roof, the bypassing of the alarm system, and the use of explosives, all these details looked similar to the robberies that they were investigating. The Ohio FBI office thought that the responsible parties for these robberies were, in fact, a large crew tied to organized crime and the mafia, and their headquarters were in Youngstown, Ohio. The Los Angeles officers were right. This gang was one of the professionals in bank robberies. The FBI Ohio office had a list of almost 100 people that worked in this gang. It was a very large gang with many different teams and staff, and each team carried out special operations. They used to help each other and share their experiences. They had experts in different domains: digging, electricity, blacksmithing, technology, and explosives. They had all the skills required to carry out all sorts of robberies, and depending on each operation and what it requires, they made up a staff or a special team to execute a particular operation. Now the question raised is, if the Ohio FBI office had all these information about all these people, why didn't they arrest them? The answer is that they had no conclusive evidence. They were unable to charge them. And they just got that list due to their investigations. The Ohio FBI office was sure that the gang that robbed the bank in Los Angeles belonged to the large gang that they were chasing. So they sent the gang list to the Los Angeles FBI office. That list contained the names and photos of each member of the gang. Since the gang's headquarters were in Ohio, they must have mostly traveled to Los Angeles by plane because the distance between Ohio and Los Angeles is more than 3,500 kilometers, so it was impossible that the thieves had traveled by car. The officer's task was to compare the gang members' names to the list of passengers that came from Ohio to Los Angeles during the period before the robbery. The process was so tiring and tough because there was no computer at the time, so they were forced to check the lists manually. Eventually, after a huge effort, they managed to identify 6 of the gang members who entered Los Angeles shortly before the robbery was carried out. Those people are as follows: Amdel Dincio, his brother James Dincio, Charles Mulligan, Philip Christopher, Charles Brockles, and Harry Barber. All these gang members had criminal records for home and small business burglaries, for which they were all imprisoned for short periods of time in their lives. However, no one had ever been arrested for a huge robbery or spent a long period in jail. As for number 1, Amdel Dincio, he apparently was the mastermind and the leader of the operation. He was the one who chose the other members of the gang. And as you can notice, he recruited some of his relatives. Number 2, James Dincio was his elder brother. And number 3, Charles Mulligan was his brother-in-law. He was his sister's husband. These two had no particular experience, and most likely their task was manual work. As for number 4, Philip Christopher had skills in monitoring. He was in charge of monitoring if someone tried to interrupt them during the operation, especially that their operation lasted for the whole weekend, and they used to come in and out of the vault several times. Therefore, they needed surveillance, which was Philip's task. Concerning number 5, Charles Brockles was the most important member of the team. He was an electronics and explosives expert. He was responsible for disabling the alarm system, and he was also responsible for installing explosives. The last member, number 6, Harry Barber, was actually a Mills nephew, and his task was manual work too. All of these 6 members arrived in Los Angeles shortly before the robbery, which automatically made them the main suspects. The problem was that the officers didn't know where to look for them. The only idea they got was to go to the airport and ask the taxi drivers if they had seen one of them before, believing that most of those suspects must have used taxis after leaving the airport. The officers interviewed each taxi driver who worked at the airport that day. It was really a huge process that took them several days to interview tens of taxi drivers, but eventually they got a lead. One of the taxi drivers, when he saw the photos that the officers showed him, said that he took a group of 5 people that looked like those in the photos, and he still remembers the trip well because they gave him a $100 tip and because of their suspicious appearance. The officers got the address from the taxi driver, which was a house in the city suburbs. The officers feared that if the suspects knew about the investigations, they would immediately leave the city and disappear. But then they had no other options. They had to take the risk and go to that house. It was their only lead. They went to the house, knocked on the door, and a man opened it. Then the officers introduced themselves and asked him some questions, through which they knew that the house belonged to Barber's family, and that the man they were talking to was actually Harry Barber's younger brother, Ronald Barber, the suspect number 6. The officers didn't have a warrant, so they were unable to enter the house, search the place, or arrest anyone. However, they asked to interview Ronald Barber, and the latter accepted. Although he agreed, he wasn't clear. Most of his answers were like, "I don't know." When the officers asked him about the 6 gang members, he said that they came to the house but didn't stay there, and everyone went to work. When the officers asked him about their work, he replied, "I don't know." After questioning, the officers thanked Barber for his cooperation and left. Although the officers were sure that Barber lied to them in some of his answers, they believed him when he said that the 6 members didn't stay in the house, which means that they mostly went to a hotel, and probably they stayed in different hotels. Firstly, the officers checked the hotels nearby the bank. They spread out, and each one went to a fine hotel in that area. Their search was pointless until one of the officers thought outside the box. Maybe the thieves didn't stay at a fancy hotel and stayed in a normal hotel instead. That officer started to target those kinds of hotels and check them one by one. Eventually, he went to a motel that is usually used by truck drivers. When he showed the suspect's photos to the receptionist, the latter pointed to Emil Dincio's photo, the gang leader, and to his brother-in-law's photo, Charles Mulligan. The receptionist said that both of them stayed at the motel around the time of the robbery. The officer asked to see their check-in registration, and he noticed that Dincio used a car plate number. The officer tracked it and found out that it was Ronald Barber's car, who was Dincio's nephew, and Harry Barber's young brother. Ronald Barber joined the suspects list. The FBI officers were almost sure that those 7 were the robbery executors, but they had no conclusive evidence that could be used against them in court. Therefore, they needed a new lead. The FBI asked for the motel room phone records in which the 2 suspects stayed. At first, they weren't sure if they would get something helpful because the gang, and especially the leader, Emil Dincio, were supposed to be careful and not use any phones that could be tracked by the police. But apparently, they weren't expecting that the police would find the motel. So they used the room phone and made several calls. When the officers got the calls list that was made from the motel room, they discovered a series of calls made by Emil to a local number in Los Angeles. They tracked the number and figured out that it was a landline phone number for a house owned by a man named Earl Dawson. After their investigations, they found out that he was an ex-soldier in the Special Forces and an explosives expert. And due to the fact that the thieves used explosives in their operation, they linked him to them and suspected him of being an accomplice. The thieves already had an explosives expert, Charles Brockles, but maybe Earl Dawson was the one who provided them with explosives. However, after a deep search of his life, it turned out that he was a very patriotic individual who had a clean criminal record and used to live a normal life. The officers decided to face him and talk to him directly. They went to his house, and when he opened the door, they introduced themselves and asked for an interview, so he accepted and let them in. The investigators immediately told him about the reason for their visit, showed him the names and photos of the suspects, and asked him about his relationship with them. At first, Dawson looked hesitant. The officers already knew about his former occupation, so one of the officers, who was an ex-officer in the Special Forces, tried to appeal to his sense of duty. Apparently, the officer's tactic worked. Dawson looked at the suspects' photos carefully, then pointed at 3 of them and said that he knew them. The 3 were Emil Dincio, his brother James Dincio, and his brother-in-law Charles Mulligan, with whom he seemed to have a strong friendship since the days he used to live in Ohio, exactly in Youngstown, where the gang was based. Dawson decided to reveal all that he knew to the officers. He said that one day before the robbery, Charles Mulligan knocked on his door with 6 other people who were in the photos. Then Mulligan offered him $100 to get out of the house and let them hold their meeting alone. Dawson accepted, took the $100, and left the house without hearing what they were talking about. Dawson surprised the officers when he told them that he had something to show them. He said that Mulligan left a car in his house's garage, and it was still there. The officers looked happy. They felt like they had finally found concrete evidence. But before checking the car, the phone rang suddenly. Dawson picked it up, and he heard Mulligan's voice. He immediately mouthed the word Mulligan, and the officers quickly got him. Dawson pointed out that there was another phone in the bedroom. One of the officers went and picked it up, and he was able to hear the call clearly. Mulligan asked Dawson if the FBI had reached out to him, and Dawson replied that no one from the FBI had come to him. At that time, the officer knew that Dawson was on their side, and he would help them arrest the whole gang. Mulligan told Dawson that the FBI was chasing him and his friends, and they tracked the places where they were, which made them worried, and they needed him to let them know if any officer or FBI agent came to him. Dawson reassured him and told him that he would say nothing and that he would immediately contact him in case the FBI tried to question him. Then Mulligan told Dawson that he wanted to come to see him and talk to him, and maybe he could move the car in the garage. When the officer heard the call, he feared that maybe Mulligan was trying to trap Dawson. Maybe he was planning to kidnap or kill him. And maybe he was outside the house monitoring them. And the whole call was just a test. The officer immediately thought that their meeting should take place in a public space. He took a piece of paper on which he wrote, "Meet him in a public place," and handed it to Dawson. The latter told Mulligan that he would meet him in his favorite restaurant, Walnut Room, and provided him with its location. They both agreed on the place of their meeting and then hung up. After the call, the officers asked Dawson to take them to the garage, where they found the car that Mulligan left. They were unable to search it because they didn't have any search warrant, and if they searched it forcibly, this would make the evidence that they would find inside useless. However, through the car window, the officers spotted one pair of black gloves, similar to the one found in the bank's vault. This was enough to get a search warrant immediately, in addition to an arrest warrant for Charles Mulligan. The plan was to arrest him when he met Dawson at the restaurant. At night, Dawson went to the Walnut Room restaurant, where he would meet with Mulligan. The officers pretended to be clients and monitored him. There were 4 officers inside the restaurant, and 2 others were outside, ready for any intervention in case of an emergency. Dawson's protection was their highest priority. The officers told Dawson that if he needed something, he just needed to go to the bathroom, and one of the officers would come after him to know what he wanted, and vice versa. If one of the officers went to the bathroom, Dawson was supposed to follow him too. The officers sat at different tables. 1 hour later, Mulligan arrived at the restaurant. As soon as he entered, he went immediately to Dawson, greeted him, and started talking to each other. During their conversation, Dawson tried to get Mulligan to talk, and after a while, he asked him if he was involved in the robbery. Mulligan replied, chuckling, "What do you think?" And then they continued their conversation. The officers were unable to clearly hear what they were talking about, so one of them went to the bathroom, and Dawson knew that this was a signal, and he had to follow him. Dawson asked for pardon and went to the bathroom, where he met with the officer, who asked for an update because they didn't hear what they were talking about. Dawson told the officer that they didn't talk about something important. He just hinted at the robbery without giving any details, and he was in a hurry to get the car from the house's garage. The officer instructed Dawson to get out of the restaurant and warned him to get in the car with him or let him take him anywhere. He also assured him that they would be monitoring them, but they didn't tell him that they were willing to arrest Mulligan immediately after they got out of the restaurant. Dawson went back to Mulligan and asked him to go to the house in order to take his car. They came out of the restaurant and walked towards the house. On their way, the FBI agents surrendered them and arrested Mulligan. They had also arrested Dawson to camouflage his cooperation. Mulligan showed no kind of resistance, but he insisted on not talking to anyone about anything. The officers took him into custody and focused on the car that was in the garage. As soon as they opened the car trunk, they found the drills, the digging tools, drill bits, hammers, and many other items. They were almost sure that these were the tools used in the robbery. The officers sorted the items and sent them to the laboratory. At that time, the officers felt a sense of victory. They thought that they had finally found evidence. These items would take a long time to be examined. The experts and technicians needed days to accurately examine the items. During that period, the officers decided to work on other leads. They followed up on the motel phone records and found a number that belonged to a real estate agency. They reached out to it and asked for the gang members. The agency manager told the officers that she rented an apartment to Ronald Barber weeks before the robbery. Ronald Barber is one of the gang members, and he was already in Los Angeles, so he was the one who rented the apartment before the others came. The apartment was on the same street as the bank. The manager told the officers that the thieves were planning to stay in the apartment for 3 months, but they left after 3 weeks. When the officers saw the date the thieves left, they realized that it was the same date as the robbery discovery. This means that they left immediately after they had finished their operation, and the robbery had been discovered. The officers immediately searched the apartment, looking for any trace or evidence that the thieves might have left behind. But apparently, the thieves were as meticulous as they were in the robbery. All the apartment surfaces were wiped clean as if they were wiped by some kind of chemical product. That is to say, the officers had found nothing that could lead them to the thieves until they opened the dishwasher. The dishwasher was full of dirty dishes and cups, and it seemed that someone neglected to press the on button. And due to the fact that it was closed, they forgot to clean it before leaving. This was a crucial mistake made by the thieves. The officers, through the used dishes and cups, managed to extract the fingerprints, which they sent to the laboratory later. When the FBI examiners compared the fingerprints found on the dishes with the ones found on the tools that were in Mulligan's car, They found out that they were identical and managed to prove that the fingerprints belonged to 5 of the 7 suspects. The tools expert matched the hammer found in the car with the damage in the safety deposit boxes and proved that the hammer was one of the tools used in the robbery. All of these evidences were considered circumstantial, but enough to arrest the suspects and interview them. One of them, Charles Mulligan, was already in the FBI custody, and the officers should look for the 6 other members and find conclusive evidences that would definitely prove them guilty, since the officers' evidence was circumstantial and the case then hinged on Dawson's testimony and cooperation. The other suspects knew that the FBI was chasing them and that Dawson was helping them. As a result, Dawson received threatening phone calls pressuring him to keep his mouth shut and not talk. Dawson had no clue who was threatening him, but the caller insisted on a face-to-face meeting to discuss the matter. The FBI officers immediately realized that this wasn't the goal of the meeting, and probably the gang wanted to get rid of him. The officers got information from their informants that the gang hired killers to take Dawson's life. As we mentioned before, the small gang, the 7 people who carried out the robbery, belonged to a bigger gang that is related to organized crime and the mafia. This kind of gang shows no kind of mercy towards the witnesses or the people that work with the police. The FBI was forced to protect Dawson from the unknown caller because he was their informant and main witness in the case. The FBI instructed Dawson to arrange a meeting with the caller at the same restaurant where he met with Mulligan. They didn't tell him that the gang was planning to kill them. They wanted to confront the killers and send a message to the gang that they were keeping an eye on them and monitoring everything. The FBI officers were confident that they could protect Dawson because they were sure that the killers couldn't kill him in a public place, and they would absolutely try to take him to another place. That's why the officers strictly ordered Dawson not to get out of the restaurant, whatever happened, and the bathroom would be the place of communication in case one of them needed something. A while later, the killers arrived at the restaurant. They were 2, and they went immediately to Dawson, while the officers were monitoring the whole scene closely. The 2 hitmen began giving Dawson heavy alcoholic drinks, attempting to get him drunk. When the officers saw Dawson start to look stressed, one of them went to the bathroom, which was a signal to Dawson to follow him. Dawson went to meet the officer and told him with a stressed tone that those 2 guys wanted him to leave with them. The officer relieved him and asked him not to worry and asked him to wait in the bathroom, and he would go to them. The officers faced the 2 guys and told them that they knew the reason for their presence in the restaurant and that they had to leave. Therefore, the 2 guys had no other option but to leave the restaurant with no reaction. This was a clear message to the gang that Dawson was now under FBI protection and they would be unable to reach him no matter how hard they tried. This wasn't enough to protect Dawson. They had to put him in the Witness Protection Program, which is a program to protect those who testify in court from the criminals that they would testify against. The FBI's next step was to arrest the rest of the suspects' gang members. After all the collected evidence, the FBI had search and arrest warrants that allowed them to follow up on everyone. The officers started by searching all their last known addresses. Of course, all their houses were in Ohio, exactly in Youngstown. During the search process, the officers got information from their informants that the thieves, in most of their robberies, bury the loot underground and keep it for years until the investigations are over. And then they get out the money and start the money laundering process. The FBI officers reached a large piece of land owned by James Dincio, who is the 2nd member of the gang and the elder brother of the gang leader, Untold Dincio. They had a big doubt that the loot might be buried there, so they started the digging process. They had even rented a bulldozer. The digging process continued for more than a week. Eventually, after all this time and effort, they got what they were looking for. There were black footlockers buried underground, and when they opened them, they found millions of dollars in cash and bonds. There wasn't only the Los Angeles bank loot, but even loot of their previous robberies. All the loots were there. This was confirmed through the money serial numbers. As it was previously mentioned, the gang had been working for a long time. They had robbed almost 13 banks in Ohio before the Los Angeles bank robbery. Imagine that the officers found most of the loot from the robberies at once, and the thieves' fingerprints were on the footlockers. So they had finally gotten conclusive evidence that could be used against the thieves in court. Finally, after the complicated investigation process that lasted for a continuous 3 months, the FBI officers began making arrests. For the leader, Untold Dincio, They found him at his house as if nothing had happened. He didn't try to escape, although he knew that they were chasing him, and he was arrested easily. As for the other members, each one of them tried to hide or escape on his way. James Dincio, a Mills brother, was arrested at the airport while attempting to escape carrying a suitcase full of stolen cash. Besides, Philip Christopher, the fourth member of the gang, was arrested and found $30,000 of the stolen money in his apartment. These four were arrested and remained insistent on the fact that they were innocent and refused to show any kind of cooperation with the officers. But they didn't know they would be betrayed. After a period of time, the FBI managed to arrest the fifth thief, Charles Brockles, the electronics and explosives expert. The officers kept pressuring him by showing him the evidence they had and telling him that he would be imprisoned for a long period of time unless he cooperated. Charles Broccoli eventually agreed and decided to testify against his friends and admit all the robbery details. In return, the officers would drop all the charges against him and put him in the witness protection program. Thanks to Charles's testimony, the case was completely resolved. 5 of the 7 suspects were arrested. Only the Barber brothers, Ronald and Harry, were left. When the police went to their house, they didn't find them, and their mother said that she didn't see them or contact them. Apparently, the brothers escaped and disappeared. Imagine that all 7 suspects had been tried, and the 2 brothers were still on the run. However, during a couple of months, the FBI received information that the brothers lived in an apartment in New York. The police went to that apartment, knocked on the door, and Ronald Barber opened it. He got arrested immediately and sent to Los Angeles. These thieves got sentences ranging from 15 years to 20 years. It wasn't a harsh sentence because there was no violence in their robbery, and most of the loot had been recovered. As for the last thief, Harry Barber, his brother refused to admit his location, and Harry remained a fugitive for 8 years. However, in 1980, a woman from Pennsylvania reached out to the FBI, claiming that one of her friends had been living with a man who said that he carried out a large and famous robbery in Los Angeles, and his real name was Harry Barber. She also told the officers that this man apparently was trying to live a normal life, and he worked in maintenance at buildings and houses. The police quickly moved and got to him, and it was really Harry Barber, the man that they had been looking for since 8 years ago. Harry got arrested and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Finally, the case was closed. One of the FBI officers claimed that the main reason that helped in the gang arrest was their overconfidence because they carried out many successful robberies before this operation. And although they were meticulous in most details, this time they made some small and dumb errors, which led to their arrest. First, they gave a big tip to the taxi driver, which stuck in his memory. Second, the use of the motel phone, through which the officer managed to track the calls. Third, they left their car loaded with their tools at Dawson's house. Moreover, the fact that they forgot to press the on button of the dishwasher. All these errors were trivial, but they made up several leads on which the officers smartly worked and managed to get the answers they needed, eventually resolving the case that was the largest bank robbery in U.S. history at the time. We have come to the end of our story today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe for more interesting stories.